With the U-joints out of the way, there's easy access to the carrier bearings. There's not much to these. It's just a press-on shaft bearing with a rubber bushing molded into a structural mount that holds the drive shaft up. After you've got the nut and the yoke off, just rip the rubber bushing off the bearing. This is what 22-year-old grease looks like. Cracked up or ripped rubber bushings are reason enough to replace them.
It's a boy!
So there's nothing in there?
Nope.
There's a rubber grease seal around the front of the bearing. It seals against the inside of the yoke we just pulled off. If you're leaking grease, it's either coming from that or an inner bearing failure that you could feel by spinning the bearing. Use your 2-jaw pullers to pull the bearing off the shaft. Clean up the shaft and re-grease it to make assembly easier. When you're installing the yoke, make sure you either grease the yoke or the grease seal on the carrier bearing. You don't want to install this dry. When you're putting this back together, you want to replace the lock nut with a new one. Our parts weren't here yet when we shot this, so we're assembling these parts to keep it clean and torquing a new nut down later.
Doing that just to make sure it's lined up straight. Get it all settled down.
In order to access the other carrier bearing, the Lobro joint has to be separated.
This is a 7mm Allen head socket. That's a 12mm wrench.
If your boot is in good shape, there's no need to go into the front of it or to separate the boot from the Lobro joint. You want to separate the back side of the shaft at the cup flange, and if you're careful you can do it without leaking any grease. In this case our boot is torn, so we're replacing and repacking it. To separate the Lobro joint from the cup flange, don't bang on the grease seal or the back of the flange. That won't do anything. Tap around the outside of the Lobro joint while pulling straight back on the shaft. From here, the process is exactly the same as the other carrier bearing. Observe how the gaskets line up and copy that during reassembly. If you're not replacing the boot, clean your socket before removing the nut that holds the cup flange on and leave the grease inside it. We're cleaning it out and re-greasing it later. Before going any farther, ensure that you have good marks on both the shaft and the flange. Yay, our parts came in. The washer has a rounded side on one edge and a flat side on the other. You want to put the flat side towards the yoke and the rounded side out. The socket for this job is 27 millimeters. If you have a 1 1/16 inch SAE socket, that would work too. Kind of a weird size that you might not have, so be aware you'll need it. Torque specification for the shaft nuts is 137 foot-pounds.
Alright, when you're putting on the carrier bearings, you'll notice that there is a little rubber lip grease seal, and there's a metal bushing on the back side. The metal bushing goes into this groove here on the shaft, and the rubber side always goes up. So what we're going to do is knock this down on here, make sure we got it lined up straight, and then you want to use this yoke. Remember, we have our marks on it to show us how that's supposed to be aligned. Right there. Find our marks on the shaft, which is on this side of the shaft. I'm going to rotate it around here for a moment. So when you do this, we just like to do this for fun. We press them on with the old nut and then take the old nut back off, and then after we're done doing that, we put the new nut on it, torque that to 137 foot-pounds. Before you torque this down, because there's grease on the inside of this flange, you want to make sure you don't get any dirt in it. So you want to, once again, wipe your socket out, because you see you don't want to get any of that kind of junk inside of your grease. Rotate to a clean part and do it again until it comes out clean.
When these lock nuts were made, they staked 3 sides lightly to make the threads on the nut grab tighter against the shaft. When you torque it down, it stretches them back out. That's why you need to replace them. So that's it for the carrier bearings. Stay tuned for the Lobro and universal joints.